Chapter 1. The Shadow, the Boy, the Mage, the Dwarf, and the Twins. Depending on your point of view, Nerys thought, mage lights were either a boon or a problem. Oh, they were fantastic things for the general population, little magical constructs that cruised the streets after dusk either singly or in flocks. They hunted people in the same way that horseflies hunt horses, except rather than bite their victims, they simply bobbed along behind them like some lovesick parrot. Their only desire was to bathe their prey in a warm, personal illumination. As soon as a victim entered a building, the mage light peeled off in search of someone else to follow. Happy little things, like fairies with a conscience. The idea, she supposed, was that they stopped the unwary traveller falling down a hole or into a canal. They also deterred any footpad, cutthroat or cut purse who might have spotted a potentially lucrative mark, who after all was going to bash some rich banker on the head and steal all their money if both assailant and banker were bathed in an ethereal magical light for the entire world to see. To the innocent bankers, weary workers winding their way home, or rowdy revellers who'd supped a tankard or two too much ale, even to the whores who stood on the darkened street corners offering a little fan, love, mage lights were the best thing since, well, bread. And therein lay the problem, of course. Not everyone who prowled the streets at night was an innocent banker. There were plenty more people in Carcamesh who liked their nighttime activities to be unilluminated, and she was one of them. You couldn't stop a mage light following you. It was pointless to even try. If you stopped one, then there were thousands more hunting an unilluminated pedestrian to latch onto. But Nerys was a shadow, a member of the Guild of Shadows, and if there was one thing a shadow knew, it was how to hide. After all, a shadow who couldn't hide was just a pedestrian. What's more, Nerys had magic in her bones, and her mother had taught her the right weave to turn the mage lights off, which was why her mage light was floating a foot or two above her head, emitting not the faintest afterthought of a glow. The 5 other people watching the house, on the other hand, were bathed in light. Amateurs, she grinned. She lay flat against the roof of a darkened building directly opposite the house she had been told the letter was kept in. The letter she had been instructed to liberate. "It's a promise letter, a proposal of marriage," Guildmaster Featherlight had said, in a high-pitched girlish laugh. "Boscombe of House Brave promises to marry Cassell of House Hith. Innocent enough, but when the contract of marriage was agreed, the House of Brave was poor, and the House of Hith was rich." Featherlight had shrugged and giggled again. "Now it's all about face, and the House of Brave wishes to find a richer husband for their darling child, so the copy of the promise letter held in the House of Hith must be liberated." "So," Nerys murmured. She felt for the wand she carried at her hip and fiddled the fingers of her free hand, casting a slight magnification weave in the air about her face as she studied the first of the 5 people. He was young, probably barely past his majority, thick-set, with a face that looked as though it had met a brick wall in a very intimate circumstance. His nose was squashed and bent, and there was a livid bruise about one eye. He fidgeted nervously from foot to foot and constantly checked his belt, where she could see the telltale glint of a blade. "Definitely an amateur," she purred. She shifted the weave to another, feeling the telltale trickle of energy bleed from her body as she did so. The second was a woman, blank-faced and taut-lipped. Her hair was scraped back tight into tidy buns behind each ear. She wore a priest's overrobe with the hood thrown back, a priest of velvet shem by the colour of it. Nerys would have doubted she ever had the right to wear it, save the heavy ritualistic kohl that was painted across her eyes, and the pearl-coloured beads that clustered about her shoulders where her veil had been thrown back. Beneath the robe, Nerys could see belts of steel knives crossing her body from shoulder to waist. Unlike the youth, this woman was studied calm, patient and confident. "A priest? Are you also here for the letter, or are you here to prevent it being taken?" Nerys whispered. She shifted the weave to the third person, a second woman, identical to the first in almost every regard, save that beneath the overrobe of priesthood, she wore a rope and grapple bound around her waist. "Now," Nerys smiled with satisfaction, "you wouldn't need a rope and grapple to protect a letter, would you? I can't imagine why you'd need one to minister to the needs of your god, either." The 4th was a dwarf, bald as a shaven chicken and as wide as he was tall. His head was tattooed with blood-red tentacles that coiled about his face and neck. "Well, aren't you a pretty boy?" Nerys murmured, Brave, too, to wear t-shirts so openly. The trickle of energy was stronger now. She could feel the tips of her fingers and toes beginning to chill as she shifted the weave again to focus on the final figure. Here was a tall, slim man, pale-skinned, his features all sharp from his overlong nose to his high cheekbones. A neatly trimmed beard covered the tip of his chin, and a moustache like a long red worm sat on his top lip. His hair was thick and deep red, and his eyes were so pale a grey that they were almost white. They sparkled with delight, and her blood ran suddenly cold as she realised he was looking directly at her through her own weave. "Tisha's balls!" she cursed, snapped the weave closed, and scooted herself away from the edge of the roof. "She's on the roof!" the man called, and Nerys risked a peek back down into the street. The man was hefting a staff aloft. She could see light skitter across it as the fingers of his free hand danced. A mage! She cursed again. The rest of the group were moving, rushing towards the building she was concealed upon, their following mage lights keeping obedient pace. The woman with the grappling rope was already shucking it off. "Not much of a mage if you don't know how to turn the lights out," Nerys hissed, and the man with the beard completed his weave, brought his elegant staff cracking down onto the cobbles, and all the mage lights went out. Not just in the street either. From her vantage point you could see the darkness spreading out around the entire circle of the city. "Shit and shitting piss!" she cursed. Then her mage light turned itself back on, so brightly it was like she had her own sun. Nerys cursed again, pushing herself to her feet, and she ran. Behind her came the traitorous little mage light, bobbing contentedly along in her wake and quite unwilling to turn itself off again no matter how many weaves she tried to cast against it. She felt a burst of air behind her and flashed a quick glance back. The mage was on the roof, the fading remnants of a portal shrinking closed behind him. A third-tier mage, then. What by Tisha's twisted arse was a third-tier mage doing chasing her? She came to the edge of the roof. Far below, at least 4 floors down, gardens lay lost in the darkness, and beyond the wider darkness of the 6th canal. Away in the distance, out on the black water, she could see ships moored for the night. Mage lights glittered on their decks. So there was a limit to the reach of his magic. From below she could hear the mage's companions crashing through the foliage. No way out that way, she thought. "We're not going to hurt you, girl," the mage striding across the roof called. "That's the last thing we want to do." Nerys turned to face him and laughed. "Maybe not," she snapped. With one swift motion she pulled the cape from her shoulders and threw it over the mage light, shutting out its glow, and then, dragging the bundle behind her, she stepped off the roof and into darkness. A thin weave thickened the air below her, slowing her fall, not so much that the branches of the trees she crashed through didn't scrape at her skin and tear her clothes, but enough that she landed more or less comfortably to crouch on cool, damp grass. She could see shadows pushing through the garden toward her. "She's here! I saw her fall! Somewhere here!" a youth called. Still hugging the cape-wrapped mage light tight to her chest, Nerys rolled beneath the low-spreading branches of something that smelled like rosemary. She let her skin settle, feeling it ripple as it took on deeper hues and rougher textures to mimic the foliage around her. The suit of Siathanin bark responded as it always did, shifting, sliding across her skin to mimic and mirror the changes she'd made to her own flesh. Elven magic, one of the most useful things she'd had from her father, after her own skin, of course, and he'd been full of useful things. This legacy from her father was one she shared with few people. She had none of the visible signs, the ears or the eyes. No one would guess by looking at her she was half elven. Her hair shifted, changed, became rich green and spiky like the leaves of the bush she sheltered beneath. From her hip pouch she pulled a pair of lenses, discs of ruby glass bound together by filaments of copper. She'd made these herself, after she'd seen one of the stallholders in the market square selling them. She was quite proud of them, even if the finish lacked elegance. It had taken her days to trickle her magic into the glass, and days to recover afterwards. She fiddled the wire over her ears, and the rose-coloured lenses settled into place before her eyes. The world came alive, as if cast in ruddy light. The boy was in the glade. "I can't see her!" he cried. Beneath the rosemary, Nerys unclipped her belt and quickly fastened it about the cape, pushing the fastening tight up against the solid shape of the mage light. Then as the boy turned towards her, she burst from cover, swinging the mage light on the end of the belt. He barely had time to see her before the mass of the light smacked him roundly in the side of the head. She heard something crack and hoped it hadn't been the light, After all, it hadn't done anything wrong. The boy was on the ground, groaning. She leapt on him, bringing her full weight down on his back, raised the mage light, and brought it down as hard as she could on his head. He collapsed without a sound. Another puff of air warned her that the mage had formed another portal. She didn't bother looking for it. She sprinted for the trees and ran straight into the dwarf. He stood in front of her, a broad grin etched across his face, and his arms spread like he was trying to catch a runaway piglet. "Come on, lovely," he chuckled. Nerys came on, wand out, fingers flicking in an intricate dance and her lips mumbling half-heard words. She tossed a weave towards him, a small thing really, nothing more than a tangling mass of cobwebs. It was all she needed to distract him. He threw up his arms to snatch the webs away, and Nerys drove the tip of her wand into his groin. As the agony of it hit him, and he doubled over, she grabbed his ears and brought her knee hard up to smash him in the lower jaw. For good measure, she jabbed her elbow into his throat. She felt cartilage crumple, and he gaped. His breath rattled, and blooded spittle covered his beard. There was a weave forming behind her, a big one. She could feel the energy swirling about the glade. "Come on, girl, we're not here to hurt you. You're far too valuable," the mage called. He laughed, a deep, confident kind of laugh that said he knew he had her, that he didn't really have to try. "Should have taken care of him on the roof," she hissed. She slid into the trees, letting them close about her. Something dropped out of the canopy to bob uselessly in front of her. Another mage light. She dropped the first by the body of the flat-faced youth. This one, though, was still dark. The problem with mages was that they were simply too full of themselves. Most she'd met thought themselves more clever than everyone else. Arrogant was the word. You only had to look at the things they made. Everything had to have the word mage in front of it. Mage tower, mage light, mage glasses, mage staff, mage chicken. As if the fact it was magic in the first place wasn't enough of a clue that it had been made by a fucking mage. They probably bottled their own piss in tiny little mage bottles and sold it as mage juice. She chuckled dryly at the thought. The sad truth of it was they really were as powerful as they believed, so enormously powerful that little short of another mage could stop them. The even sadder truth was they were right. Give them enough time and enough power and they could do almost anything. And this one had access to all the power he needed. All third-tier mages did. She, on the other hand, probably didn't even qualify as a first-tier mage. For that, you had to be apprenticed to a master. Well, magic was all very useful, but she had no desire to be a mage. She hated mages, even though she knew she was one. But unlike the mage hunting her, the power she had at her disposal was limited. Very limited. It came from her, and every weave she cast depleted her reserves further. Sooner or later she was going to tire. One mage and the twins left. Gods alone knew where they were. She sent a silent prayer to Velvet Shem that the darkness would hide her a little longer. "End this quickly, Nerys," she murmured, and she began to weave. When the mage found her, just a few moments later, she was sitting slumped against the bole of an oak. Her breath was ragged, and the muscles of her face sagged as if all the meat had been drawn out of them. She watched the mage step forward, warily. "Ah," he smiled. In one hand his staff burned with restrained fire, in the other coils of magic twisted. She didn't recognize the shape of the weave. He would know far more than she did. He had all those books to read in his tower, didn't he? "You've worn yourself to the dregs, haven't you, mage?" he murmured. "Now I'm going to have to waste a weave healing you back to health. What were you doing, casting something to catch me?" She coughed, spraying little bubbles of blooded spit into the air, just like the dwarf. "Well," he murmured. The shape of the weave in his hand changed, becoming something she did recognize, a revelation weave, one that would show him any little surprises she'd laid for him. That was a shame, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there was one rather large surprise that she really couldn't afford for him to find, and second, she had questions, and now there was no time to ask them. She watched his spell ripple through the clearing, scattering leaves and disturbing the grasses as it came, revealing nothing, yet. "I'm impressed, though," he murmured. "You took down two of the crew. The lad, well, he was always a bit simple, but the dwarf, on the other hand—" Nerys coughed again. Spraying a gutful of blood and vomit onto the ground, she rolled over and scrabbled against the oak, trying to pull herself to her feet. "My, but aren't you persistent?" the mage said, watching her intently. "Now," she thought, whilst I have his attention focused firmly in the wrong direction. And she fell on him out of the tree, landing so heavily on his back that he fell to his knees. The mirror weave she had made, huddled pathetically against the tree, evaporated like mist as she killed the flow of energy that formed it. She had her legs wrapped around him in a moment, one arm tight across his forehead, pulling his head back, and with her other hand she rammed her wand up his nose with all the power she could muster. "Yes!" she hissed in his ear. "I am persistent." The weave in his hand changed, morphing suddenly from revelation to something else, probably something deadly. His staff ignited, setting fire to the air about them, and together they screamed in pain as the fire bit, but she held on, forcing the wand deeper until she felt the thin bone within his nose fracture and the wand thrust easily into softness. His staff and the half-formed weave in his hand burst apart in an almost silent shock of force that threw her off him. She hit a tree, cracked her head hard against it, and for a moment felt the garden spin about her. Light burst on above her, and groggily she thought it must be morning, but it was just the mage light coming suddenly back to life. "Let's just take a moment," she murmured, feeling a symphony of aches and pains across her back where it had met the tree. "Little rest. Not for long, just a moment." But she didn't have a moment. Bodies were crashing through the trees, the twins. They burst into the clearing. The one with the knives already had 3 loose in one hand. Her sister held the rope in relaxed coils and twirled the grappling hook warily. They saw the body of the mage before they saw her. She saw the blood drain from their faces. Their eyes went wide. They shared a startled look. "Now," Nerys gasped, pulling herself painfully to her feet and flexing her fingers in mimicry of the way she did when she cast a weave. "Which of you wants to try where he failed? I have questions." The sisters turned and fled. "What do you want with me?" Nerys screamed after them. "What did I do to you?" They did not reply. With a sigh, Nerys half-stepped, half-crawled to the body of the mage. The tip of the handle of her wand was just visible, sticking out of his beaky nose. Stuff was slicking it, making it glisten in a gory kind of way. She considered leaving it where it was, but, well, it had been her mother's and it was used to her ways, and she realised with a sinking feeling it was the only thing she had left that linked her to the bloody woman. She tore a fragment of fabric from the mage's robes and cleaned off the end of the wand and slowly drew it out. "Do you know the worst of it?" she asked the corpse. "I still have to get that fucking letter. Featherlight is not going to believe this," she murmured.